Dr. Thomas Hartwell adjusted his glasses as he studied the data spreadsheet on his monitor. The numbers told an extraordinary story. In a small coastal town in California, residents over 80 reported happiness levels that exceeded those of people half their age. Thomas had spent 2 decades studying aging, publishing papers that few outside academia ever read. Yet this data suggested something his lab work never captured. The next morning, Thomas drove 4 hours to Seabrook Haven, the retirement community where many of his study participants lived. The facility sat on a hillside overlooking the Pacific, surrounded by gardens that residents tended themselves. He found Margaret Sullivan in the community greenhouse, her weathered hands transplanting seedlings into ceramic pots. She told him the secret wasn't complicated. Every morning at 6, she walked the beach path with 3 neighbors. They had maintained this routine for 12 years. The walk itself mattered, but the conversation mattered more. They shared worries, celebrated small victories, and laughed about grandchildren. Each person Thomas interviewed emphasized connection over isolation, purpose over leisure. They had not withdrawn from life as they aged. As Thomas drove home that evening, he realized he should have been studying how to fill life with meaning, not just how to extend it.
Nina Patel had built her journalism career on immersive storytelling. She had spent a month learning to box for a sports feature and lived in a tiny house for 3 weeks to write about minimalism. When her editor pitched a story about the daily habits of happy octogenarians, Nina immediately knew her approach. She would adopt their routines completely for 7 days. She arrived in Maplewood, a mountain town 2 hours north of Denver, on a Sunday evening. Her contact was Florence Winters, an 84-year-old former librarian who had agreed to guide Nina through a typical week. Monday morning arrived with startling brightness. Florence knocked on the guest room door at 5:30. They dressed in layers and walked through the quiet streets as dawn painted the mountain peaks orange and pink. Florence introduced Nina to her walking group, Bernard Wu, a retired postal worker, and Patricia Gomez, who had owned the local bookstore. The conversation surprised Nina. These people discussed current events with nuance and passion. They asked Nina thoughtful questions about her work and actually listened to her answers instead of waiting for their turn to speak. After breakfast, Florence spent 90 minutes working on a quilt for her great-granddaughter. She invited Nina to help. Florence explained that she always had a project in progress. The finished products mattered less than the process of making them. Tuesday brought a new routine. Florence volunteered at a food bank, sorting donations and packing boxes. Instead of a somber atmosphere, she found humor and camaraderie among the volunteers, most of whom were over 70. Wednesday afternoon, Florence attended a book club. 8 people gathered to discuss a contemporary novel about immigration. The conversation grew heated at times, but Nina noticed that Florence held her ground without dismissing opposing viewpoints. By Thursday, Nina felt the rhythm of this lifestyle settling into her bones. Her mind felt clearer than it had in months. She realized she had not checked social media since Monday. The absence created space for boredom that transformed into creativity. Friday morning, Florence asked Nina what she had learned. Nina struggled to articulate the powerful shift she felt from these simple habits. These daily practices provided structure without rigidity, purpose without pressure, and connection without performance. Florence said something memorable: real contentment grows from small daily choices, repeated with intention until they become who you are.
Robert Shin wiped down the piano keys in the community center's music room, a task he performed every Thursday afternoon. At 81, his fingers still moved with precision across the ivory. Though arthritis had forced him to give up concert-level playing years ago, he no longer minded. Teaching brought him a different kind of joy, one that felt more lasting than applause ever had. His student that afternoon was Jamie Morrison, a 10-year-old boy whose parents worked long hours. Jamie arrived with his usual bundle of energy. Robert smiled and gestured to the bench beside him. They began with scales, Jamie's fingers stumbling over the notes. Robert corrected his posture gently. He had learned patience through decades of teaching, understanding that skill developed through encouragement. As Jamie played, Robert thought about the path that led him here. He had retired from public school teaching 15 years earlier, exhausted by demands. For 6 months, He had done nothing but read mystery novels. The rest had felt wonderful at first, then suffocating. His wife, Grace, had pushed him to return to teaching on his own terms, suggesting he volunteer for children who couldn't afford lessons. She had been right. The volunteer work had given him reason to wake up each morning with purpose. He prepared lessons and watched children discover the magic of creating music. Their progress became his progress. After Jamie left, Robert walked to the community garden. Gardening required him to bend and stretch, keeping his body mobile. Victor Okonkwo worked the adjacent plot. They had become friends through proximity, discussing everything from tomato blight to grandchildren. That evening, Robert attended his weekly dinner group. 6 friends gathered to share a meal and conversation. They discussed a documentary about climate change. Robert listened, appreciating the depth of thought his friends brought to the table. Walking home under streetlights, Robert reflected on his days. He maintained routines that brought structure, but lived with enormous freedom. The secret to his happiness was not complicated. He had stopped waiting for life to deliver satisfaction and started creating it.